I let HOA Karen steal my boat because I wanted her to. That boat wasn't bait. It was a trap. And the moment she stepped onto my dock, she had no idea she was walking straight into a nightmare designed just for her. After 22 years of military service, moving through deserts, jungles, and more bureaucrats than bullets, I finally wanted nothing except silence. That's why I left the noise behind and settled into the small lakeside cabin my late uncle gifted me. The place was paradise. Cold blue water stretching past the pines, early sun breaking across the surface like melted steel, and mornings filled only with loon calls and the creak of my wooden dock. For 3 days, I lived like the world had forgotten my name. Coffee in hand, repairing the dock board by board, listening to nothing but wind brushing through needles. Then I heard it. That unmistakable, soul-piercing sound of trouble approaching. Skirch, skirch, sandals on gravel. I didn't look up. You learn in the military that some threats go away if you pretend they don't exist. But this one kept coming, closer, and then stopped behind me. The air changed, tight, expectant, like it was waiting for me to acknowledge the inevitable. Then came the voice, bright, cheerful, weaponized with fake politeness. "Good morning. I'm Skyler Campbell, with the HOA. I finally stood and faced her. There she was, the self-appointed queen of suburban order. Clipboard clutched to her chest like a holy artifact. Sunglasses big enough to reflect guilt from 20 feet away. And a pastel cardigan that practically screamed, "I run committees." She smiled at me like I was a child who needed instructions she hadn't finished writing yet. I told her my name, Benjamin Reed. But before I'd even finished, she was already introducing rules, schedules, shared stewardship, and historically communal shoreline activity. None of which applied to me because my property wasn't part of her HOA. But that didn't matter to Skyler. She pointed at my dock like it was her personal stage, talked about barbecues and weddings her community had always done here, and explained how my shoreline was an honorary zone for her residents. I told her honorary zones don't exist, just like calorie-free donuts. She didn't laugh. When I showed her the beer cans and ashes left by her so-called respectful neighbors, she blamed teens. When I mentioned the security cameras, she pretended to approve. When she tried assigning me days for lake access on a schedule I never signed up for, I told her no. When she suggested I leave my gate unlocked so strangers could walk across my land to boost community morale, I actually laughed. And that was the first crack in her composure. The moment her polite smile tightened into something colder. She warned me about creating friction, about community expectations, about citations and meetings. I warned her about trespassing and how the only schedule I followed was the law. For a moment, she just stared at me, calculating, offended, determined. And in that moment, I realized something important. This woman wasn't here to introduce herself. She was here to conquer. The war hadn't started yet, but it was about to. The next morning began exactly the way I wanted. Quiet lake, cool breeze drifting off the water, and a sunrise so orange it looked painted across the tree line. I poured coffee, stepped onto the porch, and told myself Skyler Campbell had been a one-time disturbance. Maybe she'd complain to the other HOA board members, hold a dramatic meeting, maybe even send a strongly worded letter. Fine. Paper doesn't hurt anybody. But when I walked down toward the dock, that illusion shattered. My private property sign was lying in the dirt, snapped clean off the post. Fresh footprints led straight across my shoreline like someone had deliberately marched back and forth to make a point. And at the edge of the dock, a neat little stack of anonymous flyers sat waiting for me. Lake access should be for everyone. The message was printed, but the intention wasn't. This wasn't a request. It was a warning. I picked up the stack, flipped through it, and noticed the subtle detail most people would miss. The paper smelled like citrus cleaner. Skyler's clipboard had the same scent. That woman had come back at night, crossed my fence, touched my dock, after I told her no. I wasn't angry. I was studying, because when someone tests a boundary, they're not just seeing what you'll allow, they're checking how long you'll tolerate it. And Skyler wasn't the type to retreat. She was preparing her next move. I spent the day reinforcing the fence line, tightening the cameras, and replacing the sign with a heavier post anchored in concrete. Not because I was afraid, far from it, but because I'd spent years tracking people whose behavior followed clear patterns. And Skyler had a pattern I recognized: entitlement disguised as righteousness. When someone like that faces resistance, their desperation becomes creativity. And sure enough, around sunset, I saw the first glimpse of her counterattack. A group of HOA residents gathered on the opposite side of the cove, lawn chairs, coolers, and a surprisingly expensive-looking speaker. They weren't there to enjoy the sunset. They were there to stare, to watch me, to show me I was outnumbered. Their president stood among them, arms folded, sunglasses reflecting the lake like she owned the horizon. She didn't speak. She didn't wave. She simply observed me the way someone inspects a puzzle they're determined to solve. And that told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't about access, or tradition, or community. Skyler wanted control. Control of the shoreline, control of the cove, control of me. I watched them until dusk swallowed the water in dark blue. When they finally packed up and left, I felt a shift in the air. Not fear, not anger, but a familiar sensation I hadn't felt in years. Anticipation. I didn't want to fight, but I wasn't about to lose ground on my own land. And as I walked back toward the cabin, the porch light blinking on behind me, the thought hit me plainly. The HOA wasn't done testing me. This had only been the opening move. The real conflict was coming, and Skyler was marching toward it with the confidence of someone who had never once been told no and actually meant it. But she was about to learn something important. Something my career had taught me 100 times over. When you push the wrong man on the wrong day, you don't start a conversation. You start a war. That night, the lake didn't feel like the peaceful sanctuary it had always been. It felt watched. The moon cast a pale streak across the water, bright enough to illuminate every ripple, every shadow moving between the pines. I sat on the porch with a lantern beside me, not because I needed light, but because I wanted Skyler, and whoever she had stirred up, to see that I was still awake, still alert, still here. Quiet battles start long before anyone raises their voice, and the HOA had already begun theirs. Around midnight, I heard the brittle crunch of leaves where no wind was blowing. A slow, careful step, not an animal, not a passerby. Someone creeping along the side of my fence, pausing every few seconds as if matching their heartbeat to their footsteps. I didn't move. I let the sound stretch across the darkness until the intruder felt confident enough to keep going. Only then did I stand, silent as the trees themselves, and slip into the shadows. The lantern on the porch stayed behind like a decoy version of me. Stepping closer to the fence line, I saw a faint glimmer, moonlight bouncing off something metallic. A phone. Someone was recording. I stayed back, far enough to watch without being seen. The person filming wasn't alone. Two shadows hovered behind them, whispering urgently, pointing toward my dock as if the wooden boards were trophies they intended to claim. One of them shook a padlock on my gate, testing it, tugging with the impatience of a child trying to open a cookie jar without asking permission. Then the leader lifted a walkie-talkie to his mouth. A scratchy burst of static drifted across the trees, followed by a familiar voice on the other end. Skyler's, calm, cold, commanding. Get clear footage. We need proof he's blocking community shoreline. So that was the play. She wasn't trying to take the lake. She was trying to manufacture a legal reason to force me into compliance. A false claim? A staged video? Something she could take to whatever HOA tribunal she presided over like a queen presenting a captured rebel. I watched the group circle my fence with the confidence of people who believed nothing could touch them. They rattled the gate again, this time harder, as if provoking me would give them better footage. What they didn't realize was that my cameras, hidden in places they hadn't noticed, were recording them just as clearly. Timestamps, faces, audio, the whole orchestrated performance. Skyler thought she was hunting for evidence, but she was creating mine. I waited until they moved farther from the gate before I stepped out of the shadows. The gravel shifted under my boot, loud enough for them to hear, but not loud enough to locate me. The leader froze first, then the others. For several seconds, the only sound was the water lapping softly against the shore. Then I spoke. Not shouting, not threatening, just announcing myself the way a person does when he's done being patient. Nice night for a walk, I said. Flashlights whipped around wildly. One beam caught my jacket, then the trees behind me, then the fence. They were disoriented, caught between running and pretending they had an excuse to be there. The leader stammered something about checking the shoreline, but even he didn't sound convinced. I walked forward slowly, letting the boards under my feet creak just enough to make the moment heavier. When I reached the fence, I rested my hand on the padlock Skyler claimed was blocking her community. If you're looking for lake access, I said calmly, there's a public launch a quarter mile that way. I pointed down the road. If you're looking for trouble, you're already late. Someone beat you to it. They exchanged panicked looks. The leader finally muttered something about HOA business and motioned for the others to leave. They hurried off through the trees, tripping over roots they hadn't noticed on the way in. I watched them go until the last flashlight disappeared behind the brush. But Skyler's voice lingered in my head, cold and calculated. The voice of someone determined to win a battle she had created herself. And as I walked back to the cabin, the night felt different. Not dangerous, not frightening, just inevitable. Skyler had escalated. She had brought her people. She had challenged my boundaries with the confidence of someone who assumed I'd eventually break. She didn't understand something fundamental. I don't break, I build. And while she was busy filming my fence, I was building the trap she'd never see coming. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. The sky was still bruised with shades of violet, and the lake lay perfectly still, as if holding its breath, waiting for whatever came next. I brewed coffee, stood at the edge of my porch, and replayed last night's events in my mind. Skyler sending people onto my land, secret filming, the walkie-talkie orders, the lies about historical shoreline access. It wasn't about the lake anymore. It wasn't even about me. It was about control. The kind of control people chase when they've spent too long in meetings where they're always the loudest voice in the room. Just as I took my first sip, I saw a familiar gleam down the road, the HOA caravan. 3 cars, 1 SUV, 1 golf cart that should never have been allowed on public roads. They parked like a tactical unit staging an operation, doors swinging open in perfect synchronized ignorance. And then she emerged. Skyler Campbell, president of Lakeview Serenity, stepping out like she was arriving at a ribbon-cutting ceremony, sunglasses on, clipboard in hand, mouth set in a thin, polite smile that always meant bloodshed. Figuratively, I hoped. She walked right to my property line and tapped the fence with her pen. "Benjamin, we need to talk." I stayed on the porch. "We already did." Her smile sharpened. "No, yesterday was an introduction. Today is clarification." Behind her, her board members, 4 of them, fanned out like background actors. One held measuring tape, another held a drone controller, a third carried a stack of papers thicker than a divorce settlement. And the last one just looked terrified to be there, probably dragged along because the HOA bylaws required a quorum to harass private citizens. Skyler lifted her clipboard. "I reviewed last night's incident." "Incident?" I asked. "Your refusal to provide community shoreline access." "You mean when your people trespassed?" Her smile didn't move, but the skin around her jaw tightened. "Benjamin, you're standing in the way of 50 years of tradition." "Funny," I said, "because I found my uncle's old paperwork. There's no mention of that tradition anywhere." "Unrecorded traditions are still traditions," she insisted. Her board murmured agreement like trained parrots. Then she pointed dramatically at my dock. "Your structure violates community expectations. It obstructs shared views. It restricts public water usage." It's my dock. "And," she continued without listening, "your cameras invade neighbor privacy." I almost laughed. "You broke into my yard to film my fence. The cameras didn't invade anything. You did." Skyler ignored that. Instead, she pulled a folder from her stack and held it out like it was a holy text carved onto stone tablets. "Benjamin, unless you voluntarily allow lake access, we will vote on a formal action. We can file a complaint with county zoning. We can petition for a shared right-of-way. We can escalate this legally." The sun finally broke through the trees, lighting her face just enough for me to see the satisfaction growing behind her sunglasses. She wasn't bluffing. She genuinely believed she could force me to open my land. I walked down the porch steps slowly, not threateningly, just enough to close the distance. Her board members shifted nervously. "Skyler," I said quietly, "you think I'm just some guy fixing a dock? But what you don't know is that I've dealt with people far more stubborn, far more entitled, and far more dangerous than a homeowners association." One of the board members swallowed hard. "You're trying to pick a fight with someone who spent 2 decades preparing for real ones." Her lips trembled, not with fear, but with indignation. "People like Skyler don't get intimidated. They get offended." "This isn't over," she said. "I know," I replied. And for the first time, her composure cracked. She stormed off, her little squad following behind her. The war wasn't coming anymore. It had already started. By afternoon, I'd already drafted the beginnings of my counterattack. This wasn't revenge. This was engineering, planning, precision. The kind of trap that works not because it harms someone, but because it exposes who they truly are. First, I reinforced the dock. Every board, every bolt, not visibly. The trick to a good trap is subtlety. You want everything to look normal on the surface. But beneath the planks, I added motion sensors, pressure plates, and a hidden anchor mechanism. Nothing harmful. Just enough to trigger alarms and cameras the moment someone stepped where they weren't supposed to. Next, I checked all my trail cameras. I repositioned 2 of them strategically. One angled at the shoreline, one at the back gate, both hidden so naturally that even a seasoned tracker would mistake them for shadows. Then I crafted what I knew Skyler wanted most. A window of opportunity she couldn't resist. I took my boat, a small aluminum fishing boat my uncle rebuilt, and I anchored it loosely near the dock. Not locked, not covered, not protected. Just sitting there. Tempting. Easy. Vulnerable. A shiny piece of bait floating under the sunlight, promising the one thing Skyler wanted most. Evidence. Leverage. A story she could twist, because Skyler wasn't after property. She was after control. By late afternoon, the lake grew quieter. A storm rolled in from the far ridge, clouds stacking like bruises on the horizon. Wind curled across the water, tossing small waves at the shoreline. Perfect cover for someone who didn't want to be seen. Thunder grumbled in the distance. Then, at 7:42 p.m., my motion sensor blinked. I opened the live feed. And there she was. Skyler Campbell, wearing a raincoat as white as her SUV, hair tied back, sunglasses still on, even though the sky was nearly black with clouds. She crept onto my dock, scanning the water as if expecting an audience. She wasn't alone. One board member lingered by the road, watching, pretending to scroll through his phone while actually recording everything. Skyler stepped closer to the boat, looked around, and placed her hand on the bow. That was her mistake. The moment her weight shifted onto the dock, the pressure plate clicked. Her head snapped up. A spotlight blasted on. Sirens erupted across the property, sharp, echoing, unmistakable. Skyler screamed. The board member dropped his phone in the mud. The boat jerked sharply as the anchor mechanism locked it into place like a steel jaw. And Skyler realized, too late, the boat she thought she was stealing was the trap I had built just for her. The storm finally broke open, rain hammering down in sheets so thick you could barely see 10 feet ahead. But the flashing lights from my alarm system cut through the storm like a lighthouse warning a ship away from jagged rocks. Only this ship had already crashed. I walked down toward the dock slowly, taking my time, letting Skyler feel every second of humiliation. She was frozen in place, one hand still gripping the boat, the other shielding her face from the rain. Her hair plastered to her cheeks, mascara streaking down like she'd cried ink. "Let go of the boat," I said. My voice wasn't angry, just tired. Skyler jerked her hand away, as if the metal burned her. This is unnecessary," she shouted over the wind. "You're trespassing," I replied. "I was documenting a violation." "You mean stealing my property?" "It's not your lake," she screamed back, voice cracking. "Nothing belongs to you. We have rights." I lifted my phone. The screen displayed a crystal-clear live stream of her stepping onto the dock alone, touching the boat, trying to loosen the anchor rope. Her words died. Behind her, the board member finally ran down the road toward us, slipping twice and nearly falling into the water. His phone was still covered in mud, useless. He stammered, "Skyler, let's just go. He's recording. He has everything. Let's..." But she wasn't listening. People like Skyler never listen when reality contradicts their beliefs. Instead, her fury cracked open into pure desperation. "You tricked me." "No," I said. "You exposed yourself. You set a trap." "I set a boundary. You walked into it." Lightning flashed behind us, illuminating her like some unhinged mythical creature rising from the storm. She looked at her board member, then at the cameras, then at me. And something changed in her expression. Fear. Real fear. Because she finally understood the truth. Everything she'd planned to accuse me of, I now had evidence against her. Trespassing, attempted theft, conspiracy, harassment, Her kingdom of clipboards couldn't protect her from that. She backed up slowly, slipping once, but catching herself. The board member grabbed her elbow and practically dragged her toward the road. "This isn't over," she whispered, trembling. "You're right," I said. "It's just beginning." Skyler had pushed every boundary a person could push. And by this point, it wasn't just an HOA dispute. It was a psychological war. She had that look in her eyes that I'd seen before in places far more dangerous than a lakeside neighborhood. The look of someone who believes rules don't apply to them. That kind of person is unpredictable, and unpredictability is a threat. The lake was quiet that night, eerily still, like nature itself was holding its breath. Moonlight stretched across the water like a blade, cutting the darkness into silver ribbons. Inside my cabin, the only sound was the slow tick of the wall clock. But my instincts were screaming. Years of training didn't just teach me how to fight. They taught me how to feel danger long before it arrived. And tonight, it was close. I checked every trap, every sensor, every switch. Floodlights calibrated, motion detectors active, decoy lines set. The boat positioned exactly where it needed to be. But something felt different, heavier, sharper, like the air itself had weight. Skyler had a pattern: daytime harassment, nighttime recon. She believed she was righteous, untouchable, a queen enforcing imaginary laws. People like that become most dangerous right before they lose. I turned off the porch light, killed the coffee maker, slid the curtain open just enough to watch the shoreline. Far across the fog, a tiny flicker of a flashlight trembled. Too slow for a runner, too steady for an animal, too familiar to be anyone else. This wasn't a drunk teen or a curious neighbor. This was Skyler Campbell, moving with the confidence of someone who thought she had already won. But tonight wasn't her victory. Tonight was the night she would learn exactly what happens when someone tries to take something from a man who spent 2 decades surviving deserts, jungles, and bureaucrats far scarier than any HOA board. And the lake, silent, patient, cold, was ready to witness it. At exactly 2:13 a.m., the perimeter sensor pinged. One sharp vibration on my wrist monitor. Breach dock area. That single alert struck harder than any alarm because it meant one thing. She finally made her move. I stepped off the porch silently and slipped into the shadows along the tree line, my boots barely touching the ground. Fog skimmed across the lake like drifting ghosts, and right in the center of it, my boat rocked gently, not from wind, from hands. Skyler was crouched beside it, hoodie tightened, flashlight tossed aside, fingers working fast to untie the knots. She wanted to steal it clean and quiet, a final lesson for the stubborn newcomer who wouldn't bow to her imaginary kingdom. She didn't know she was untying a bait line. She didn't know the tackle box beside her held a pressure switch tripwire. She didn't know the plank beneath her foot was engineered to do one thing. I waited until her weight shifted. Then I pressed the remote in my hand. Boom! Floodlights exploded across the dock like a stage opening on a criminal caught mid-scene. Skyler froze, eyes wide like a deer staring into a truck's grill. "Step away from the boat, Skyler," I said. But she didn't. Instead, she panicked. And panicking people make mistakes. She bolted left, straight onto the loose plank. The trap snapped instantly. Her legs slipped, her balance vanished, and she tumbled headfirst into the freezing lake. With a splash so loud, it echoed against the forest walls. Her scream cut through the air, sharp, terrified, real. That was the moment the arrogance washed off her just as fast as the lake water soaked her clothes. I shone the flashlight on her as she flailed, cardigan dragging her down, her precious clipboard floating beside her like the obituary of her authority. "You set me up," she cried. "No," I said, kneeling at the edge. "I set a boundary. You're the one who crossed it." I let her grab the dock ladder, because teaching her a lesson didn't mean I had to become like her. She climbed out shaking, dripping, furious, and for the first time since I met her, silent. The lake around us stilled again, as if satisfied. Skyler finally understood. No committee vote, no clipboard, no badge, and no amount of self-importance could own this shoreline. Respect could. And for the first time, she finally had some.